Holy antipathy of God to sexual perversion and to licentiousness again is picked up and expanded and underscored in the Mosaic legislation. And I ask you to turn now to Leviticus 18 as a specimen passage. Leviticus chapter 18. The great concern of God is articulated in verse 2. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God. After the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein you dwelt, you shall not do. And after the doings of the land of Canaan, where I bring you, you shall not do, neither shall you walk in their statutes. And then in verses 6 through 18, God gives specific directions that all fall within the realm of laws against incest. Laws against certain marriages within certain blood relationships. Laws against incest, verses 6 through 18. Verse 19, God gives a prohibition of what we would call an unnatural sexual activity. Verse 20, he speaks against adultery. Verse 21, he speaks against the sin of offering up children to heathen idols as blood and burnt sacrifices. And then in verse 22, notice the clear prohibition. You shall not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Thou shalt not lie with any beast to defile thyself therewith. Neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereto. It is confusion. God is very explicit in prohibiting all forms of sexual perversion, all forms of sensuality, all forms of adopting the policy, my sexual appetites and preferences are my business. I shall fulfill them according to the dictates of my own passions and my own inclinations. God says you shall not do so. Now, why is he concerned about these matters? Why is this legislation hammered out in such detail, which it is almost embarrassing to read in a mixed public gathering? Well, God gives the reason in the following verses, and I ask you to follow again as I read. Verse 24. Defile not yourselves in any of these things, for in all these things the nations are defiled, which I cast out from before you. And the land is defiled. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land vomits out her inhabitants. You therefore shall keep my statutes and mine ordinances, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the homeborn nor the stranger who sojourns among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done that were before you, and the land is defiled, that the land vomit not you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. Oh, dear people, hear the word of God. The nations in the land of Canaan were pagan, non-covenanted nations. The law they had was the law inscribed upon their moral consciousness as creatures made in the image of God. And yet from that law they were to know that these activities were sin. And when they defied that law of their own moral constitution, God uses graphic language. He says that Israel's conquest of the land was but the feather in God's hand to tickle the throat of the land of Canaan, that it might retch and vomit out the inhabitants of the land. That's the gross, sickening language of Jehovah. The lands of Canaan, the nations of Canaan, that's the language of the passage, had become defiled and polluted for these things. National sins that provoked God to bring national judgments. And as then, so it is now. Even though our nation has the light of special revelation in the possession of the Word of God and in the preaching of that Word, even if we did not have the light of special revelation, when a nation gives itself to the kind of sexual perversion, the kind of sensuality forbidden in this chapter, adultery, indifference to proper laws concerning incest, insensitivity to the sanctity of the one-to-one marriage sanctuary of a husband and a wife, when people give themselves to homosexuality, the passage says the land becomes defiled, the nation becomes defiled, and mark it well, God will have a feather in His hand to tickle the throat of this nation until it vomits out the inhabitants of this land. Whether He causes us to be vomited into a grave of atomic dust, whether He causes us to be vomited into the hand of a foreign totalitarian power, whether He causes us to be vomited out into the disruption and disintegration of civil and racial war, I do not know. I am no prophet, but I am a preacher of this book. And this book says these sins defile the land. We have gone beyond the stage of toleration. We are now in the stage of acceptance. Legislation is being pushed through to give open, self-confessed, practicing homosexuals full acceptance at every level of social, economic, educational life, and even religious life. So the great debate in many denominations centers around the ordination of homosexuals. And already in some places we have proceeded beyond mere toleration and mere acceptance to aggressive propagation and forced seduction. How long will it be before the feather touches the throat of this nation? Add to the testimony of Genesis 18 and 19, the testimony of Leviticus chapter 18, the clear teaching of Romans chapter 1. We move out of the Old Testament into the New. The great theme of this epistle is the exposition of the gospel, which is the power of God unto salvation. A gospel which sets forth a righteousness of God to be received by faith. But the dark backdrop of that righteousness of God is the filth and the unrighteousness of man. And most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the basic thread of argument in Romans chapter 1. Beginning with verse 18, the apostle declares that the wrath of God is present tense. There is a coming wrath. He talks about it in chapter 2. There is a coming day of wrath, but there is a present manifestation of divine wrath. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven. And it's revealed against all ungodliness, and that which inevitably follows from ungodliness, all unrighteousness of men who hinder the truth in unrighteousness. And then he goes on to declare in this context the situation in which men had only the light of general revelation. What they could know of God by looking at His handiwork, the heavens which declare His glory, and the firmament which shows His handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night shows forth knowledge.